So I wanted to talk through the S14 subframe swap that I did on the GTR. The initial benefits are going to be that you're going to get less anti-squat or more squat, which means better corner exit on bumpy roads. You're going to get permanent HICAS delete, so no lockout bars or things that you're attaching to the subframe. You're just going to run S14 toe arms, and that's going to be the permanent solution, which also then allows you to run a bigger diff cover. So instead of running the GTR diff cover, you could run a S14 rear diff cover, which allows for almost 1 quart of extra space. You're going to get additional roll center if you choose to run the subframe up against the chassis, or if you put a spacer on the top and run it in the regular location, you'll have regular roll center. For those people who lowered their cars, it's better to get the additional roll center. And for those who don't run very aggressive wheels, you're going to get 20 mil of wider track, 10 mil on each side. Because I run very aggressive wheel setups, I opted to pull the arms in and just run the regular configuration. That wasn't a benefit that I needed. So a few more things that are worth noting. First, the GKTech offset bushings that I used didn't come with all the spacers. I just think the GTR chassis is different than the GTSTs or S14s. You're going to have to make a aluminum spacer to supplement the difference in space. Second is I would recommend running polyurethane bushings for the subframe just because it gives more compliance. If you're a perfectionist and you're a master at doing what you do and you want to use this solid subframe bushings, you can, but once you press them in, it'll be harder to adjust if you're slightly off. So I felt that that was a better option for me. Here you can see the S14 subframe installed and the S14 toe arms being the permanent HICAS delete. The GKTech reinforcement plates were welded and installed. The subframe was then sandblasted and powder coated a sparkle silver finish. Having the fresh powder coat on makes it easy to identify leaks, and cleaning any road grime or dirt makes it super simple. For the rear cover, I ended up with a GKTech Billet rear diff cover for a S14. Reason being is that it has more capacity than the GTR rear cover. The R200s are all pretty much the same anyways, so if you could fit a bigger one, why not? For the diff itself, I went with a Nismo 1.5 slash two-way diff that is interchangeable based on the configuration. I opted to do the 1.5 way. While I was in there, we also upgraded all of the axle bearings and pinion bearings and seals. This Nismo setup also came with the stub axles, which are different than the OEM ones. Took the opportunity to go ahead and rebuild the rear axles. So just taken apart, sandblasted down, rebuilt with OEM boots and high performance grease from Redline. I had the rear knuckles removed, vapor honed, and completely cleaned. The OEM bushings were pressed out, and SPL solid pillow ball bushings were pressed in and installed. While I was there, I also did brand new wheel bearings and seals. As mentioned earlier, you get 20 mil of extra track. Since I'm running very aggressive wheels, I actually don't need the extra track. So I reached out to SPL and asked them to modify the upper control arm so that I can essentially make them shorter. What they did was they used different rod ends that they had and they machined out the current arms that I had and adapted different hardware to make it short. And then here you can see the comparison with what they sell online compared to what I end up getting. And I saved, I think, almost an inch worth of track, which is nice because it essentially undid the difference in track. So here is where the suspension geometry on the S14 differs from the S13. The way that the arms are more angled, I think this is why you actually get more squat out of the corners. But because you switched arms, you have to either run R33 lower control arms if you want to keep stock, or you have to get an aftermarket arm, which would be like an IKEA Formula or a GKTech. I opted to run the GKTech arms and upgraded all of the bushings on there. So on the front inner, I got an Aurora or FK bearing. And then for the outers, because of the custom length, you actually can't get an aftermarket Aurora or FK. They end up being too short. There's not enough thread. So GKTech actually finally sells the upgraded bearing, and I highly recommend if you're buying this kit to run it. Here you can see the difference between the two, where one doesn't kind of have that outer shell. There's no Teflon lining, and the upgraded one does. Another thing to note is that the GTR rear sway bar does not fit after the conversion. You have to get an S14 rear sway bar. Luckily, White Line makes one as well, so I got to keep the same brand. I bought a S14 one, and I'll show some comparison photos here. You can see the GTR just leans too far forward, which with the suspension geometry change and how it looks, you can see why it doesn't fit. And just some final things to close out my thoughts, but you will have to remember to get the centric bolt lockout washers if you get the rear arms. You'll be doing all the adjusting on the arms and you won't be using the centric washers with those bolts. And then another thing to point out is that on the diff, on the R32 GTR, there is a carrier that goes with the subframe and it kind of sandwiches in. Here's some photos I got off the internet with what it would look like on the OEM setup, but on the S14 setup, you're just gonna get two of the bushings, and since I went with solid, it's just like this, and then it mounted onto the car via the bolt. And the last thing I wanted to reiterate that I talked about earlier really quickly is that you will have to have custom spacers made on the bottom portion of the subframe. Here is a photo of what it looks like in the front, and then this is what it looks like in the back. You are going to choose to either put this on the top or the bottom based off of your roll center requirements.